My wife left when our daughter was just 8 months old. I took Cameron back to my parents' house, hoping they would give us shelter, but only a few months later, they pushed us out onto the streets as if we were nothing but burdens, penniless and homeless. I wandered with my baby girl until we ended up under a bridge, living among strangers and cold winds. I thought I had reached the bottom of life, but that night a man in an expensive suit appeared, introducing himself as my grandfather, even though I had been told he had died long ago. I am Ronald Holt, 31 years old, a factory worker from a small industrial town in Indiana, and my life collapsed faster than I ever thought possible, just months earlier. I had a modest home, a job, and a family. Now all of that was gone. Every morning at 5:00 a.m., I dragged myself out of bed to the steel factory, the roar of machinery, the acrid scent of burning metal, and the sweat that dripped endlessly down my face were constants in my life. Still, I worked without complaint, because I believed I was building a life for Melissa, my wife, and Cameron, our daughter who was my world. Our small apartment with its stained walls and battered furniture was not much, but it was home. Melissa had stopped working after Cameron was born, and though the financial burden weighed heavily on me, I told myself this was what a man should do: provide, endure, and protect. But small cracks began to appear in our life. Melissa's eyes no longer carried the warmth they once held. Her smiles became strained, her words fewer. I came home late some nights to find her sitting in silence, scrolling quickly on her phone as if hiding something. I tried to brush it off. She was my wife, the mother of my child. She wouldn't betray us. But deep down, unease gnawed at me. The distance between us grew, silent yet suffocating. Cameron, though, was my light. At 8 months old, she looked at me as if I was her universe. When she grabbed my finger and laughed, all the exhaustion and doubt slipped away. I would whisper, "You're my treasure," and feel as if I could endure anything. But those moments didn't stop the storm that was gathering in my home. One evening I returned early and caught Melissa shoving her phone into her pocket, her face pale. Later, when she went to shower, I gave in to the suspicion and checked her phone. The messages I read shattered me: intimate words to another man, plans to meet, lies about seeing friends. The truth was undeniable. My wife had betrayed me. When I confronted her, she admitted she had fallen for another man, saying he made her feel alive, that she wanted a divorce, and that she could not care for Cameron. She left us that night with nothing more than a suitcase, her eyes dry, her heart cold. She did not even look back at her daughter. I stood there in silence, holding Cameron, while everything I had fought for dissolved before my eyes. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, court hearings, and loss. The small apartment, the pride of my hard labor, was sold off cheaply to split with Melissa. The meager savings I had built vanished in legal fees and debts. Melissa moved on with her lover, never once asking about Cameron. And I, broken but still breathing, clung to my daughter as the only reason I kept moving forward. I turned to my parents, hoping blood ties would at least give Cameron and me shelter. My father, Kenneth, allowed us to stay but demanded I contribute to expenses. My mother, Denise, treated me as though I was an inconvenience. They gave Derek, my younger brother, every ounce of affection, preserving his room and his comforts, while I was given a dusty storage room and constant reminders of how I had failed. Their favoritism stabbed at me, but I stayed quiet. I worked endless shifts at the factory, barely scraping enough for childcare and rent to my own parents, all while enduring comparisons to Derek, their golden child with a good career and a perfect family. Still, I endured, whispering to Cameron each night that somehow we would make it. But my parents' patience wore thin. When Derek's wife gave birth to twins, their attention shifted entirely. They bought toys, clothes, and filled the house with laughter for Derek's children, while Cameron received nothing but complaints for crying too much. Finally, my father gave me 2 weeks to leave. "We need the room for Derek's kids," he said coldly, his eyes empty of love. My mother stood silently, her agreement clear. Once again, Cameron and I were unwanted. I begged for more time, but my father turned away. To them, I was no longer a son, just a burden to be cast out. I moved into a decaying apartment on the outskirts of town, rented with the last of my savings. It was small and damp, but at least it was ours. I thought I could make it work, but childcare costs were too high, so in desperation, I carried Cameron with me to the factory, hiding her in the break room while I worked. It didn't last long. When the foreman discovered her, he fired me on the spot. Without a job, I could no longer pay rent. Soon, my belongings were tossed onto the street. I called my parents one last time, begging for help, but my father refused. "We have to take care of Derek's kids," he said, and hung up. That was the moment I knew Cameron and I were truly on our own. We ended up under a highway bridge. The nights were cold, the days long, and I begged at soup kitchens and churches to keep my daughter alive. Strangers showed us more kindness than my family ever had. A mechanic named Joe gave me a tent. A woman named Maria, raising her own child, gave Cameron clothes. For a time, I survived on their compassion, but storms came, and despair weighed heavily. One night, as rain poured down and the wind tore at our tent, I held Cameron tightly, whispering for help to a God I wasn't sure was listening. Then, through the storm, a shadow appeared, an old man in a black suit, holding an umbrella, his eyes sharp and sad. He stepped closer, his voice steady. "I am your grandfather," he said. My heart froze. My father had always told me he was dead, but here he was, alive, standing before me. He told me his name was Philip, and that my father had lied for years, erasing him to cover a theft that gutted the family and left my grandmother to die heartbroken. I stared at the lines in his face and saw pieces of my father there. The same cool blue eyes, the same stubborn tilt of the mouth, but softened by grief. Suspicion warred with need. The wind cut through the canvas and Cameron shivered against my chest, her fingers cold even through the blanket. Philip crouched under the umbrella and said he had been looking for me since hiring investigators, that he knew about Melissa, the eviction, the bridge. "Let me help you make this right," he said. My pride fought to speak, but a father's instinct answered first. I nodded once and told him I would go, but that if he lied, I would never forgive him. Not while breath lived in me. He only nodded, opened the umbrella wider, and led us to a long black car idling nearby with its lights like two patient eyes in the rain. Inside the car was heat and a child's seat already buckled in. And when he saw my surprise, Philip only said, "I came prepared." I buckled Cameron in and watched her stop crying as warmth and quiet wrapped around her. We drove through the storm to a small airport, where another set of lights waited like a runway of second chances. I didn't ask questions. Exhaustion had emptied me of language. On the plane, a steward wrapped us in clean blankets and handed me a bottle for Cameron that she took greedily. I closed my eyes for a moment and woke to daylight over water the color of a promise. In Tampa, another car took us past palms and low golden buildings to a gated estate where the road bent at a fountain and the house rose wide and bright with tiled roofs and wide windows that had known years without worry. I stepped out with Cameron on my shoulder and asked if this was his house. "Ours," he said, as if the word had been waiting in his mouth for a long time. The first hour felt unreal, a calm housekeeper greeting us by name, a chef setting down bowls of hot soup and fresh bread, a doctor arriving with a leather case and quiet hands. He listened to Cameron's lungs and declared her chilled and tired but not in danger. Then looked at me and said the stress in my body had grown roots that needed pulling up with rest, good food, and time. I ate without tasting, slept without dreaming, and woke to the sound of my daughter's soft breathing, steady and safe, like a metronome found at the bottom of a crashed song. In the days that followed, the house uncoiled around us, a small orchard where the leaves whispered, a library lined with stories I had never had time to read, a clean kitchen where every cupboard shut softly as if it respected silence. Philip did not pry. He asked about practical things, sizes for Cameron's clothes, whether I preferred coffee or tea, if I could swim, and then left me space enough to grow back into my own skin. He hired a nanny named Sophia, gentle and unhurried, who handled Cameron not like a project but like a person, for the first time. I learned small things I had missed while surviving, how to ease a baby's gums with a clean finger, how to tilt a bottle to spare her belly from air, how to read the signs of tired before the storm of tears. Cameron's cheeks colored again. Her laugh returned, and she began to toddle across the carpet toward a line of soft blocks, as if the floor had always been meant for play. I took long showers and watched the water run clear. ate meals with protein and greens and flavor, and slept until morning without the fear of cold waking me like a knock at the door. In the quiet of the evenings, Philip and I would sit on a balcony where the pool mirrored the first stars, and he would speak in careful lines about the past, as if placing stones across a river so I could cross without slipping. The truth, he told, was a slow fire. My father had emptied a safe of cash and bonds, sold heirlooms, vanished with lies that ruined 2 lives and cracked a third. My grandmother's heart had failed after the shock, and Philip had been left to start over at 50 with nothing but a name and a refusal to disappear. Over decades, he clawed his way through real estate, building a company on the discipline of someone who had already buried one life. He didn't ask me to forgive my father. He didn't ask me to forget. He only asked that I allow the truth to sit where the lie had been, so it could widen the room inside me where a different future might live. Some nights anger woke me like a siren. Other nights I felt only a strange relief, the way a body aches after a splinter is pulled and the skin begins to knit. When he finally asked if I wanted work at Sunbay Properties, he spoke plainly. Start small, no special treatment, earn your footing. I looked down at my hands, clean now but still remembering steel dust, and told him I knew nothing about real estate. He said I knew about people, and that sometimes was better. I accepted because I could not live forever on gratitude. A man must add weight to the house that shelters him, or he becomes a ghost inside it. On my first morning, I put on a simple suit Philip had insisted I take, hugged Cameron until she squirmed, and drove to a glass tower where the lobby smelled faintly of citrus and fresh paper. Philip introduced me only as Ronald, a new hire. He left, and I took a chair at a small desk where a coworker named Kyle showed me how to dial strangers and speak without sounding like a thief. I failed more than I succeeded that week, but failure without hunger is a different storm. And I kept going. At night, I returned to the mansion to find Cameron asleep with her thumb curled near her mouth, and I would feel gratitude rise like a tide that does not apologize for flooding the shore. On the balcony, with the dark, warm, and the pool a quiet sheet, I told Philip about the day's calls, what I had learned, what I had botched, and he listened like a man who remembered every early stumble by name. Stay honest, he said. Trust builds slower than money but lasts longer. I held those words the way I once held factory rails, and in the morning I went back to the phones with a steadier voice. The bridge felt like a far shore, the storm like a chapter that had closed without erasing the lesson written in its margins. I did not forgive my father. Not yet, but I began to understand the shape of the man I wanted to be by standing exactly where he had refused to stand. Weeks bled into months, and the work that had once felt foreign began to feel natural. I learned how to explain the advantages of a modest condo without sounding like I was reading from a script. How to guide hesitant families through paperwork without pushing too hard. How to hear the difference between a polite maybe and a quiet no. Clients hung up on me. Some snapped, others listened, and little by little, I found a rhythm. Kyle kept saying my strength was that I never pretended. People can smell lies, he told me. You just tell it plain, and they believe you. That honesty, born from scars I never wanted, began closing deals. The first one was a couple who had saved for years for a small beachside home. They said my calm explanations made them feel safe. And when I walked them through signing, I felt a surge of something I hadn't in years: pride. Not the fragile pride of surviving, but the solid pride of building. At night, I carried that feeling home with me, where Cameron was growing faster than I could track. She toddled across the orchard grass, laughed when Sophia sang, and learned to call me daddy in a voice so clear it silenced every ghost. Each success at work I tied to her, each commission I saved in her name. I was no longer just surviving, I was planting something, even if I did not yet know how tall it would grow. Philip watched quietly from the edges, asking only that I keep pushing. He never flaunted his wealth or dangled it like a lure. He let me earn my place in his world, one phone call at a time. Over the years, I rose slowly but steadily. Colleagues who first saw me as just another new hire began to trust my judgment. I listened during meetings, suggested compromises when disputes flared, and earned a reputation not for being the loudest, but for being the most steady. The senior manager, Helen, told me once after a long presentation, "You've got leadership in you." Ronald, integrity sticks out like a lighthouse. Don't lose it. That night I sat on the balcony, repeating her words under my breath as Cameron slept in the next room. Integrity, something my father had bartered away, was the only currency I would never sell. 3 years passed like a sudden tide. By then I was no longer the factory worker with oil-stained hands, but a man trusted with clients, teams, and strategies. Philip let me stand on my own, but I knew he was watching. Then, one morning, in a boardroom with glass walls that reflected the Florida sun, he stood before the managers and announced that I would take the role of CEO. Applause filled the room. My heart pounded as I shook his hand, unable to believe the path from steel dust to this moment. "You did this yourself," he told me quietly. "I just gave you the chance." I hugged him, feeling both gratitude and resolve. I promised myself I would never let this company, or the family it had become, fall the way my father had let his own family crumble. The responsibilities were immense. I had to oversee expansion into new markets, meet with investors, and make decisions that could sink or save millions. But every challenge reminded me of nights under the bridge, of promises whispered to Cameron. I refused to gamble recklessly. Once, during a market downturn, we were offered a risky deal with high profits, but I rejected it. "We don't play with people's futures," I said in the meeting. And though profits dipped, our reputation rose, clients trusted us more, and contracts multiplied. The company thrived, not on clever tricks, but on a culture of trust. I kept my office door open, ate lunch with employees, and reminded them I had once been like them, scraping by. The respect that grew was not built on fear but on shared purpose. Cameron flourished alongside my work. She attended a private school, learned piano, swam like she was born for water, and filled the mansion with laughter. She would climb onto my lap after dinner and ask what I did at work. "I help people find homes," I told her, kissing her forehead. For years I had thought home meant walls and a roof. Now I understood it meant safety, love, and the refusal to abandon everything I did. I tied to her smile. Every contract signed, every strategy drawn, was a brick in the legacy I was building for her. The world noticed. A business magazine featured my story from homeless under a bridge to CEO of a thriving real estate company. The interview spread quickly, and people wrote letters thanking me for giving them hope. On a morning show, I sat beneath studio lights and told the story plainly: Melissa's betrayal, my parents' cruelty, the bridge, and the hand Philip had extended in the storm. Life taught me failure isn't the end. I told the camera, if you keep moving forward, even broken, the road can rise again. The audience applauded, and I felt a strange release, as though I had finally spoken my past into the open air where it could no longer choke me. But the past has a way of finding its own stage. One afternoon, the receptionist called my office, her voice uneasy. "Ronald, there are 2 people in the lobby. They say they're your parents." My hand froze on the pen, the weight of years pressing down. Kenneth and Denise, the ones who had thrown Cameron and me into the cold, were waiting below. I stared out the window at the bay glittering under sunlight and told myself I was no longer the weak son who had begged for shelter. I was a man who had rebuilt his life without them. Still, I told the receptionist I would come down. Some debts of the heart must be faced, not ignored. I stepped into the lobby where the chandeliers spilled light onto polished marble. And there they were. My father in an old suit that clung too tightly. My mother in a worn wool coat that looked borrowed from a thrift rack. Their eyes darted around the building, not with admiration, but calculation, as though weighing its worth. My father forced a smile that barely held together. "Ron, my boy, we saw you on TV. You've made it. We're so proud." My mother chimed in quickly, syrup dripping from her tone. "Yes, Ron, family should reconnect. We could even help you manage all this." She gestured at the marble floor as if laying claim to it with her hand. For years I had imagined this moment, the words I might say, the fury I might release. But when it came, I felt no anger, only clarity. I looked at them both and asked if this was what they called help. The same kind of help they gave when they cast me and Cameron into the rain. When they saved Derek's room, but emptied mine of love. Their faces tightened, excuses forming on their lips. But before they could answer, the sound of steady footsteps filled the air. Philip walked into the lobby in a tailored gray suit, his presence as sharp as a blade. My father froze as if struck by lightning, his mouth opened, stammering. "Dad, you're alive!" My mother gripped his arm, her face drained of color. Philip's voice rang out clear, each word striking like a gavel. "Yes, Kenneth, I am alive. You told the world I was dead to hide your theft. You stole everything I had saved, left your mother to die of heartbreak, and abandoned me with nothing. And when your own son needed you, you turned him away in favor of Derek. That is the family you chose." He pulled documents from his pocket receipts. Reports, proof etched in ink and time. My father stuttered about borrowing, about spirals, about misunderstanding. But the papers were undeniable. My mother faltered, whispering that they had never meant harm, that times were hard. But her eyes betrayed her, filled with shame she could no longer bury. The lobby fell silent. Employees lingered at the edges, their whispers carrying like wind through leaves. My parents, once the arbiters of my shame, now stood exposed in front of strangers. My father's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his lies had finally crushed him. My mother clutched his arm, eyes searching the floor for an escape. They left in silence, their figures shrinking as the glass doors closed behind them. I watched without satisfaction, without hatred. What I felt was release, like a door long bolted had swung open, letting air into a room that had been stifled for years. But Philip was not finished. A week later, he called me into his office and said, "Ronald, it is time to close this chapter properly." He arranged a company meeting and invited Kenneth and Derek under the guise of a business discussion. I suspected his intention, but did not object. Some truths must be spoken aloud for all to hear. The day of the meeting, the grand conference hall filled with employees and managers. Kenneth and Derek sat in the front row. Derek wore a flashy suit, his expression smug, whispering to my father that this was likely the moment I would share the fortune. My father kept his eyes down, as if afraid to meet mine. Then Philip rose, his voice commanding the room with the weight of 80 years. "I am announcing my official will," he declared. "Sunbay Properties needs a worthy successor. I have chosen not by blood but by character." He turned to me, his gaze steady. "Ronald Holt has proven himself through integrity, resilience, and leadership, from sales associate to CEO. He built this company stronger. He will inherit the majority of my estate and full control of the company." Applause thundered through the hall. Helen, the senior manager, smiled warmly, and colleagues clapped until their palms echoed off the high ceiling. I rose, embraced Philip, and whispered my thanks, my voice breaking, across the room. Derek's face drained of color. He leapt to his feet, shouting that it was unfair that he was also a grandson. My father's voice followed, pleading, "Philip, please forgive me. Ron, speak to him. We're family." The room went still, all eyes on me. I walked onto the stage, looked directly into my father's eyes, and said with a calmness I never thought I could carry, "The day you threw me and Cameron out, I lost my father. The only man I respect now is my grandfather." The silence after those words was heavier than any scream. My father sank into his chair, pale and trembling. Derek tugged at his arm, dragging him up, and together they left, their backs bent under the gaze of the staff. There were no more excuses, no more lies to spin. They were gone, and with them went the last shadow of power they held over me. That evening, back at the mansion, I sat with Cameron at the long dining table where Philip joined us, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "You've done well." "Ronald," he said. Cameron laughed from her chair, the sound bright as bells, and I realized our home was now filled with what had been missing all my life, love given freely, not bartered or withheld. After that meeting, life seemed to shift into a new rhythm, one where the weight of old wounds no longer pulled at my every step. Sunbay Properties thrived, but more importantly, I thrived as a father, each morning. I rose not to the sound of factory whistles or my parents' criticism, but to Cameron's laughter echoing down the wide hallways of the mansion. She was growing quickly, her once chubby hands now graceful as she learned to write her name, her giggles filling the garden as she chased butterflies under the Florida sun. I had once whispered to her under a bridge that I would find a way, and now every day proved I had kept that promise. Philip often joined us for breakfast on the patio, sipping his coffee while Cameron dipped toast into her orange juice and chattered about her day at school. He would smile, the lines in his face softening, and I could see the healing in his eyes as well. He had lost a son, but found a grandson, and through Cameron, a great-granddaughter who adored him. The mansion no longer felt like a stranger's house, it became our home. Sophia, The nanny grew into something like family too, a caring aunt figure who balanced her time between guiding Cameron and giving me space to shoulder my duties as both father and CEO. Work was demanding, but I carried it with a pride born from pain. I traveled to new branches, met with investors, and steered the company through challenges with the same resilience that had once kept me alive under a bridge. When setbacks came, I remembered the cold nights when Cameron shivered against me, and I pushed harder. Knowing nothing I faced in an office could compare to those battles, employees respected that I stayed grounded. I never locked myself in the top floor, but ate in the cafeteria, listened to concerns, and made sure no voice was ignored. Sunbay became not just a company, but a culture built on trust. One evening, as I walked Cameron along the beach, she asked why I always told her stories about the bridge people, as she called them. I knelt down, brushing sand from her hair, and told her that kindness often comes from those who have nothing left to give, but still choose to share. Remember that. Kid, I whispered, family isn't just who shares your blood, it's who stands beside you when the world turns cold. She nodded with the seriousness of a child who sensed truth, and I knew the lesson had taken root. The past, though, never fully vanished. Sometimes I would dream of Melissa. Her back turned as she walked out of our apartment with that small suitcase. Other times I'd wake with the memory of my parents' house, where Cameron's cries were treated as noise instead of life. But instead of breaking me, those memories reminded me of what I had built. They were scars. Yes, but scars prove that healing has taken place. 3 years after Philip named me CEO, Sunbay Properties had expanded into Georgia and the Carolinas. Revenues soared. But what mattered to me most was that employees stayed loyal, clients trusted us, and the company's name carried integrity. During one press conference, a reporter asked what my guiding principle was. I paused, then said simply, "Never forget where you came from, and never forget who you're fighting for." The words were printed in bold the next day, and I smiled when I saw Cameron had cut out the article and taped it above her desk in her room. At home, evenings became sacred. Philip, though aging, remained sharp, telling Cameron bedtime stories of his childhood, of fishing trips and lessons from his own father. I would stand in the doorway and watch her eyes light up, and I knew she would grow with roots deeper than mine had ever been allowed. The house echoed with warmth now, meals shared together, laughter over spilled milk, even quiet moments when Cameron practiced piano and Philip hummed along softly. One night, after a long board meeting, I returned to find Cameron asleep on the couch, her school books scattered, Philip dozing in a chair nearby. I covered them both with a blanket, sat down, and stared out the wide windows at the Florida night. The stars blinked over the ocean, steady and eternal. I thought of the path that had led me here: betrayal, eviction, cold bridges, and finally, this peace. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of certainty. I was no longer just surviving. I was building a life, a legacy, one that Cameron could inherit not in money alone, but in values that could never be stolen. Still, life is not without its echoes. Occasionally, I would hear news of Derek and my parents. They had dwindled into obscurity, scraping by, no longer boasting of success. They never called again, never wrote. And though I carried no forgiveness for their choices, I carried no hatred either. They had lost themselves in greed and favoritism. I had found myself in hardship and truth. That difference was enough. On Cameron's 7th birthday, Philip gathered everyone in the garden, the tables lined with flowers and balloons. He raised a glass, his voice steady but laced with age. "To Cameron," he said, "the light that brought our family back together." As cheers rose around us, I felt Cameron squeeze my hand and whisper, "Daddy, we're happy." Right, I knelt and kissed her forehead. "Yes, kid, we're happy, and we'll stay that way." Time carried us forward like a tide, steady and relentless. Cameron grew taller, her steps more confident, her questions sharper. She was curious about everything: why the sun looked bigger on the horizon, why the sea never stopped moving, why I sometimes stared at old photographs with a look I could not hide. I answered gently, never burdening her with the full weight of the past, but enough so she would understand that the life we lived now had been earned through storms. Philip doted on her endlessly, his age softening the sternness that had once defined him. He told her stories of resilience, of starting again when the world had taken everything, and she listened with wide eyes. soaking up his wisdom like sunlight. My role as CEO deepened. The company grew beyond Florida, branches opening in new states, each one carrying the same foundation of trust we had built. I traveled often, but I always made sure to return home in time for Cameron's recitals, her swim meets, or simply to tuck her in at night. I never wanted her to feel the absence that had once scarred me. Employees began to look to me not just for direction but for inspiration. They said I led differently, that I carried empathy into every meeting, that I understood what it meant to struggle. They weren't wrong. Every decision I made was rooted in memories of hunger, cold, rejection. I built policies that helped employees in hard times, housing programs for clients who feared they would never own a home. Sunbay became not just a company, but a refuge. Media attention returned now and then, calling me the bridge to boardroom CEO. I never chased it, but I didn't shy from it either. If my story could show someone else that despair wasn't the end, then it was worth telling. On one occasion, a young man approached me after a speech. His clothes were worn, his eyes hollow with the weight of struggle. He said, "I slept under a bridge too. Hearing you makes me believe I can stand again." I shook his hand firmly and told him, "You can. One step at a time." That night, I went home and told Cameron the story, and she hugged me tightly. "Daddy," she said, "you help people the way Grandpa helped us." Her words filled me with a warmth no accolade could match. Philip aged gracefully, but I could see time tugging at him. His steps slowed, his hair thinned, yet his mind remained sharp. One evening, as we sat together watching Cameron play in the garden, he turned to me. "Ronald," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I don't regret the years I had to rebuild, but I regret the years I lost with you." I placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he had given me and Cameron more than I ever thought possible. He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it balances." In the end, that night, I carried his words to bed like a blessing. Years after the bridge, after Melissa, after betrayal in cold streets, I stood in my office overlooking Tampa Bay. The water shimmered under the morning sun, steady and bright, just as Cameron's laughter echoed in my memory. My phone buzzed with reports, meetings, demands, but none of it shook me. I had learned the hardest way that wealth and power meant nothing without love and integrity. Those values, forged in suffering, became the compass for every choice I made. The lesson was clear. Blood may tie people together, but love and responsibility make a family. My parents had abandoned me, choosing Derek over their own grandchild. Melissa had walked away without looking back, but Philip, thought dead, had returned. Not because he owed me, but because he chose to. His choice had rewritten our lives. Cameron grew up not in the shadow of betrayal, but in the light of care freely given. And I, once a broken man clutching a child under a bridge, had become someone she could look up to. Sometimes, late at night, I would walk out to the balcony with Cameron beside me, her small hand in mine. We would gaze at the city lights stretching into the horizon. I would point and say, "That's our world now. Remember, no matter how dark it gets, you keep moving, you never quit." She would nod, her eyes reflecting the glow of the skyline, and I knew she carried my words in her heart. Like, share, and subscribe if this story touched you. Leave a comment below about the moment in your life when you chose to keep going, even when the odds were against you.